Grace was trusted with a child, but never with the truth. Inside a wealthy home, silence became judgment, and love became dangerous. When accusations surfaced and loyalties were tested, one decision changed everything. Because some truths stay hidden until they can no longer be ignored. Before we begin, subscribing costs nothing, and it helps this channel grow so we can keep sharing stories like this. Now, let's begin. Grace had learned over the years how to take up as little space as possible. It wasn't something anyone had taught her directly. It was something life had carved into her, quietly, one moment at a time. She moved through the large, immaculate house as the sun rose, her bare feet barely making a sound on the polished hardwood floors. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and toasted bread as she packed Oliver's lunch, cutting his sandwich into perfect triangles, aligning the apple slices just right. She did everything carefully, as if precision could somehow prevent things from breaking. Oliver sat on the counter, swinging his legs, humming softly. "Grace?" he asked, suddenly stopping mid-tune. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are you going to leave too?" Her hands paused for a fraction of a second. Grace turned toward him, lowering herself until they were eye to eye. "Why would you think that?" Oliver shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling. "People always leave." Something tightened in her chest. She reached up and brushed his hair away from his forehead. "Not everyone," she said gently. "Some people stay." Oliver studied her face as if trying to memorize it. Then he nodded. "I like when you stay." "I like staying with you too," she replied, her voice steady, even as her heart wavered. From the doorway, James watched. He hadn't meant to stop. He was already late for a call, jacket draped over his arm, phone pressed to his ear, as numbers and deadlines blurred together. But the sight of Grace kneeling in front of Oliver, the quiet intimacy of the moment, made his feet slow. Then stop. For a brief second the house didn't feel so empty. James looked away, swallowing something he didn't quite want to feel. "Oliver," he said, his tone calm, practiced. "Bus leaves in 10 minutes." Oliver hopped down. "Bye, Grace." He wrapped his arms around her waist without hesitation. Grace stiffened, then relaxed, resting one hand lightly on his back. "Have a good day, okay?" James cleared his throat. Oliver grabbed his backpack and ran toward the door just as Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her heels striking the floor with sharp, deliberate clicks. "Good morning," Margaret said, though it sounded more like a formality than a greeting. "Morning," James replied. Margaret's eyes moved immediately to Grace. They always did. She didn't smile. She never did. "Oliver," Margaret said, her voice softening instantly. "Come here." Oliver hesitated, glancing back at Grace before walking over. Margaret kissed his cheek, adjusting his collar with a tenderness she reserved only for him. Then her gaze returned to Grace. "You're cutting the apples again," Margaret said coolly. "I told you he prefers grapes." "He ate all his grapes yesterday," Grace answered quietly. "I'll buy more today." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't buy groceries in this house. You follow instructions." "Yes, ma'am," James exhaled slowly. "Mother, it's fine." Margaret ignored him. "You should be careful, Grace," she said, folding her arms. "Children get confused when boundaries aren't clear." Grace nodded. "I understand." But Margaret's eyes lingered, sharp and searching, as if she were looking for something to confirm a suspicion she hadn't yet named. Later that afternoon, the house felt heavier. Oliver was at school. James was locked away in his home office, voice low but firm as he spoke into his headset. Grace folded laundry in the quiet hum of the laundry room, her thoughts drifting the way they sometimes did when her hands were busy and her mind wasn't. She didn't hear Margaret enter until she spoke. "You've grown comfortable here." Grace looked up. "Excuse me?" Margaret stood in the doorway, her posture rigid. "You've been here 6 months," she continued, "longer than the others." Grace set the towel down carefully. I try to do my job well." Margaret stepped closer. "This isn't just a job. This is a family." Grace met her gaze. "I know." "No," Margaret said. "You don't." There was a pause. The air between them felt tight, brittle. "You've been alone with my grandson far too much," Margaret said quietly. "People notice." Grace's heart skipped. "I'm his babysitter." "And yet," Margaret continued, "he talks about you constantly." Grace swallowed. "Children attach easily." Margaret's eyes flickered. "So do women who know where they stand." Grace felt heat rush to her face. "I would never—" "That's enough," Margaret snapped. "I've lived long enough to recognize patterns." That evening, James found Grace in the kitchen, her movements slower than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she replied automatically. He studied her. "My mother can be intense." Grace forced a small smile. "She loves Oliver." "She does," James agreed, "sometimes too much." Their eyes met just briefly. Something passed between them. Not attraction, not yet. Something quieter. Recognition. "I appreciate what you do," James said. "For Oliver." Grace nodded. "He's a good kid." James hesitated. "You're good with him?" Their hands brushed accidentally as he reached for a glass. Both of them froze. "I'm sorry," Grace said quickly, stepping back. James cleared his throat. "No, It's fine." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The next day, everything changed. Grace arrived early as usual, only to find Margaret already waiting in the living room, seated stiffly with a folder in her lap. "Sit down," Margaret said. Grace obeyed. James entered moments later, confusion etched across his face. "What's this?" Margaret placed the folder on the table. "It's time we address the situation." "What situation?" James asked. Margaret looked directly at Grace. "Oliver deserves clarity." Grace's stomach dropped. "I don't understand," Grace said softly. Margaret opened the folder and slid a document forward. James's eyes scanned the page, his face drained of color. "This is a DNA test request," he said. Silence fell like a weight. Grace's breath caught. "Why would—" Margaret stood. "There have been inconsistencies. Timelines that don't add up." James looked at Grace. "Is this true?" Grace's voice shook. "I don't know what you think you're implying, but I have never—" "We'll know soon enough," Margaret said coolly. "The truth doesn't lie." Grace stood slowly, her legs unsteady. "You think I would use a child?" Margaret's eyes were cold. "I think desperation makes people reckless." James closed the folder. His jaw tightened. "We'll do the test." Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I've done nothing wrong," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "Then you have nothing to fear." But as Grace walked back to her room that night, she knew something irreversible had already begun. Because the truth they were looking for wasn't the truth they expected. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a house that suddenly felt hostile. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall, the distant creak of wood settling. A DNA test. The words replayed over and over in her mind, each time landing heavier. She pressed a hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe slowly, the way she'd learned long before she ever stepped foot into this house. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Control what you can. Survive the rest. Grace had always known this job wouldn't last forever. She'd just hoped it would end quietly. The next morning, Oliver noticed immediately that something was wrong. "Grace," he said, frowning as she helped him with his shoes. "Are you mad at me?" Grace's heart twisted. "No, sweetheart, why would you think that?" "You didn't sing today." She hadn't realized she always did. Grace smiled, soft but tired. "I'm just a little sleepy." Oliver nodded, then leaned in close. "Grandma was talking about you last night." Grace's hand stilled. What did she say? Oliver hesitated. She said grown-ups lie sometimes. Grace forced herself to keep smiling. Did she? Oliver nodded solemnly. But I know you don't. Grace swallowed hard and hugged him. Thank you for trusting me. From the hallway, James watched again. He told himself he was imagining things, that his discomfort was just stress, just guilt for letting his mother overstep as she always did. But something about the way Grace held Oliver, like she was protecting him from something unseen, made his chest tighten. Later that day, James found Margaret in the sitting room. You blindsided me, he said quietly. Margaret looked up from her book. I protected you. You humiliated her. Margaret closed the book. If she has nothing to hide, there's no humiliation. She's done nothing but care for Oliver. And yet, Margaret said calmly, children don't bond that deeply without reason. James ran a hand through his hair. You're reaching. I'm preventing another mistake, Margaret replied sharply. You trusted once before. James stiffened. Don't. You lost your wife because you ignored warning signs. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, Margaret said, and love makes men blind. James said nothing. That afternoon, Grace received a message asking her to come to the clinic. The test was scheduled. She sat in the sterile waiting room, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching families come and go. Some were laughing. Some were tense. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. She didn't. When the nurse called her name, Grace stood slowly, her legs trembling just enough that she noticed. This will be quick, the nurse said kindly. Just a swab. Grace nodded, opening her mouth obediently. As the swab brushed against her cheek, she closed her eyes. She wasn't afraid of the result. She was afraid of what it would cost her. Back at the house, Oliver waited by the window. Is Grace coming back? He asked. James hesitated. Yes. Oliver's shoulders relaxed. Good. When Grace returned that evening, the house felt different. James met her in the entryway. Are you okay? She nodded. It's done. I'm sorry, he said. She met his eyes for the first time since the confrontation. I know. They stood there, the distance between them heavy with unspoken questions. Days passed slowly. Margaret watched everything. Grace noticed the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, the way James seemed torn between trust and doubt, the way Oliver clung to her a little tighter, sensing the tension he didn't understand. One evening, as Grace helped Oliver with his homework, James lingered nearby. You're very patient, he said. Grace smiled faintly. He's worth it. James hesitated. My mother can be convincing. Grace nodded. So I've noticed. I should have handled it differently. Grace looked up. You did what you thought was right. Their eyes met. The air shifted. Oliver looked between them. You both look sad. James crouched beside him. We're just thinking. Oliver considered this. You should think happier thoughts. Grace laughed softly before she could stop herself. James smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. The test results arrived sooner than Grace expected. Margaret called everyone into the living room. Grace stood near the edge, her heart pounding. James held the envelope, unopened. Whatever this says, he began, I want to be clear. Margaret interrupted. Open it. James hesitated, then tore it open. He read silently, once, twice. His face changed. Grace's breath caught. James? He looked up slowly, disbelief etched into every line of his face. This doesn't make sense, he said. Margaret frowned. What does it say? James looked at Grace, his voice barely audible. It says Oliver isn't my son. The room went utterly still. Grace felt the world tilt. Margaret's face drained of color. That's impossible. James shook his head. The test proves who the father isn't, Grace whispered. Then who? James swallowed hard. And in that moment, everything they thought they knew began to unravel. Grace didn't remember sitting down. One moment she was standing, the room spinning softly around her, and the next she was on the edge of the sofa, her hands gripping the fabric as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. "Oliver isn't your son?" Her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears. James stared at the paper again, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. "That's what it says." Margaret took a sharp step forward. "There's been a mistake." James shook his head slowly. "This lab doesn't make mistakes." Grace felt something strange settle over her. Not panic, not fear. Clarity. She stood up. "May I see it?" Margaret hesitated, but James handed her the paper. Grace scanned the results calmly, her eyes moving quickly. She didn't need long. She had always known. "It's accurate," she said quietly. Margaret's head snapped toward her. "How would you know?" Grace folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "Because Oliver isn't James's biological son." James looked at her sharply. "You knew?" "Yes." Margaret's voice rose. "Then you lied." "No," Grace replied, her tone steady. "I stayed silent." James ran a hand through his hair. "Grace, explain." She took a slow breath. "Oliver's father is James's brother." The words fell into the room like shattered glass. Margaret staggered back, lowering herself into a chair. "That's not possible." "It is," Grace said softly, "and it's the truth." James stared at her, stunned. "My brother died years ago." "Yes," Grace said, "before Oliver was born." The room felt impossibly small. Margaret's voice trembled. "This is absurd." Grace met her gaze. "He was visiting. He stayed longer than he should have. Your daughter-in-law never told James." James closed his eyes, memories clicking into place, things he had never questioned before. "She was already pregnant when we married," Grace nodded. "She found out after." Silence stretched. James sat down heavily. "So, this test only proves what Oliver has always been," Grace said. "Your family." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. "And you knew all this?" "Yes." "And you still took this job?" Margaret demanded. Grace hesitated. "I needed work." "That's not an answer." Grace lifted her chin. "I also needed to protect a child who had already lost one parent." James looked up sharply. "Protect him from what?" Grace swallowed. "From the truth, until he was ready." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And who gave you that authority?" Grace didn't answer. "Because the truth was more complicated than any of them knew." Later that night, James found Grace standing in the backyard, staring out at the darkened garden. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. Grace didn't turn. "Because it wasn't my secret to tell." "You let my mother accuse you." "I've been accused before," she said. "I survive it." James's chest tightened. "That doesn't make it right." She turned then, meeting his eyes fully. "Nothing about this is right." They stood in silence. "I trusted you," James said finally. "And I never betrayed that trust," Grace replied. "Not once." James exhaled slowly. "I believe you." Something inside her cracked just slightly. The next days were chaos. Lawyers, phone calls, arguments whispered behind closed doors. Margaret oscillated between anger and grief, her certainty shattered. James withdrew into himself, struggling to reconcile love, loyalty, and truth. Oliver felt it all. "Is something wrong?" he asked Grace one afternoon. Grace knelt in front of him. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes." Oliver frowned. "Like forgetting things?" "Yes," Grace said softly. "Big things." "Will you stay?" he asked. Grace hesitated. James appeared in the doorway. "She's staying." Grace looked up at him, surprised. James met her gaze. "If you want to." That night, Grace sat alone in her room, memories surfacing uninvited. She thought about her father, the uniform folded neatly in a drawer she rarely opened. The way he'd taught her discipline, silence, restraint. The way she'd learned early that love didn't always mean safety. She had chosen this life intentionally. Children, quiet, simplicity. She hadn't planned on feelings, and yet here they were. Sometimes a story doesn't touch you because it's dramatic. Sometimes it touches you because it feels familiar, because you recognize the silence, the restraint, the quiet strength it takes to stay when leaving would be easier. Stories like this are made for those who still believe in connection. If that's you, you're in the right place. The next morning, Margaret summoned Grace. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said stiffly. Grace nodded. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," Margaret insisted. "I judged you." Grace met her eyes. "You weren't wrong to protect your family." Margaret swallowed. "I was wrong about you." Grace said nothing. James entered the room. "I spoke with my brother's estate." Margaret stiffened. "He never knew," James continued. "He never knew Oliver was his." Grace closed her eyes briefly. James looked at her. "You carried this alone." "Yes?" James's voice softened. "You shouldn't have had to." Something unspoken passed between them. Later, as Grace helped Oliver with a puzzle, James sat beside them. "You're good at this," he said. Grace smiled faintly. "It's just patience." James watched her hands, the way they guided Oliver without forcing, encouraging without pressure. "You're good at a lot of things," he said quietly. Grace looked up. Their eyes met. The air shifted again, heavier this time. Oliver grinned. "You're sitting too close." James laughed softly. "Is that so?" Grace felt warmth creep into her cheeks. That evening, Margaret watched them from the hallway, and for the first time, her suspicion wasn't about Grace's intentions. It was about James's heart. Grace noticed the change before anyone said it out loud. It was in the way James lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, in how his voice softened when he spoke to her, in how Margaret watched them now, not with suspicion, but calculation. The house had stopped holding its breath. James found himself inventing excuses to be near Grace. "Oliver wants to show you something," he'd say, even when Oliver was happily occupied, or, "I need help choosing a book," when the shelf was clearly full. Grace noticed. She pretended not to. She had learned long ago that some things, when acknowledged too soon, disappeared. One evening, Oliver fell asleep early, exhaustion finally winning after a long day. Grace tucked the blanket around him, smoothing his hair gently. James stood in the doorway. "He's been calmer." "Ah, he feels safe," Grace said quietly. James nodded. "Because of you." Grace turned, startled. "Because of consistency." James stepped closer. "You bring that." Their hands brushed again, accidentally. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. "I'm sorry for what my mother did," James said softly. "For what I allowed." Grace met his eyes. "You were protecting your family. So were you." The words lingered between them. Grace took a step back. "I should check on the laundry." James let her go, but something had shifted. Margaret watched all of this from a distance. Later that night, she confronted James in his study. "You're getting attached," she said. James didn't look up. "I trust her." "That's not what I said." James closed his laptop. "Grace isn't the enemy," Margaret exhaled sharply. "She knows things that could damage this family." "She's protected it," James replied, "even from itself." Margaret hesitated. "People don't do that without motive." James met her gaze. "Sometimes they do." Margaret said nothing, but her expression hardened. The next day the school called. Oliver had gotten into an argument with another child. It was nothing serious, but James insisted on picking him up himself. Grace went along. In the school hallway, whispers followed them. "Isn't that the babysitter? I heard something about a test." That family always has secrets. Grace kept her head down. James noticed. "Hey," he said quietly as they walked outside. "You don't deserve that." Grace smiled faintly. "I'm used to it." James stopped walking. "You shouldn't have to be." They stood there, the school doors closing behind them. Oliver tugged on Grace's sleeve. "You look sad." Grace knelt. "Just tired." Oliver frowned. "You should rest with us." James swallowed. "You're always welcome." Grace looked up at him, their eyes locked. That night, Grace sat on the edge of her bed holding her phone. She hadn't called her father in years. She didn't know why she did it then, maybe because the past was surfacing whether she wanted it to or not. "Grace?" her father's voice answered, older, steadier than she remembered. "Hi, Dad." There was a pause. "Are you okay?" Grace exhaled slowly. "I'm trying to be." They spoke briefly, about nothing, about everything. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. She didn't hear James knock. "I'm sorry," he said when she looked up. "I didn't mean to intrude." Grace wiped her eyes quickly. "It's fine." James hesitated. "You don't talk about where you came from?" Grace nodded. "Some places are easier to leave than explain." James stepped inside. "You don't have to explain anything to me." Grace laughed softly. "That's the problem." Silence filled the room. "I don't want to cross a line," James said carefully, "but I need you to know. I see you." Grace's breath caught. "I see your restraint, your kindness, the way you choose silence when noise would be easier." Grace looked away. "James, I'm not asking for anything," he continued. "I just don't want you thinking you're invisible." Grace met his gaze again. "I've survived by being invisible." James stepped closer. "You don't have to hear." Their proximity felt dangerous now, electric. Grace took a step back, her heel catching on the rug. She stumbled. James reached out instinctively, catching her by the waist. They froze. Grace's hands pressed against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. James didn't move away. "You don't have to be." For a moment, it felt like the world narrowed to the space between them. Then Oliver's voice echoed faintly down the hall. "Dad?" They sprang apart. Grace laughed breathlessly. "That was close." James smiled, a little shaken. "Yeah." But neither of them forgot the way it felt. The next morning, Margaret made a call. It was time, she decided, for the truth to come out, fully. And when it did, it wouldn't stay inside the house. The truth didn't arrive quietly. It never did. Grace first sensed it when the house began to fill with unfamiliar voices. Phones rang nonstop. James's office door stayed closed longer than usual. Margaret moved through the halls with purpose, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Something was coming. James found Grace in the kitchen that afternoon. "My mother called a family meeting," he said carefully. "Extended family, lawyers, trustees." Grace's hands tightened around the mug she was holding. "About Oliver?" James nodded. "About everything." Grace inhaled slowly. "Then it's finally happening." James studied her. "You don't have to be there." Grace shook her head. "Yes, I do." That evening, the living room transformed into a courtroom. People Grace had only seen in photographs filled the space. Voices overlapped. Judgments were made before anyone spoke officially. Grace stood near the back, quiet as always. Margaret rose first. "For years," she began, "this family has protected a lie. Tonight, that ends." Grace felt James's eyes on her. Margaret continued, "The DNA test revealed that Oliver is not biologically James's son." Gasps rippled through the room. "But," Margaret added sharply, "he is still blood, my grandson, and the truth about his father will now be known." Grace stepped forward. "No," she said calmly, "it won't." Margaret turned, startled. "Excuse me?" "You can expose whatever you want," Grace continued, "but you will not turn a child into collateral damage." The room went silent. Margaret's voice hardened. "You overstep again." Grace met her gaze. "I've been overstepping my entire life just to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." James stood. "She's right." Margaret looked at him. "James, I'm done letting fear decide for us," he said firmly. "Oliver is my son," whispers erupted. Margaret's composure cracked. "You would choose her judgment over mine?" "I choose my child," James said, "and I choose honesty." Grace felt something in her chest finally release. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. "Legally, James is Oliver's father," Margaret faltered. "But the estate is secure," James said, "because family is more than blood." Margaret looked at Grace then, really looked at her. "You knew," Margaret said quietly. "And you stayed," Grace nodded. "Yes." "Why?" Grace swallowed. "Because someone needed to." Margaret's eyes filled with something like grief. "I was trying to protect him," Grace softened. "So was I." The room held its breath. Margaret exhaled slowly. "Then perhaps I chose the wrong enemy." The meeting dissolved slowly, people leaving in murmurs and half-glances. Later, Grace stood alone on the terrace. James joined her. "You didn't have to do that." Grace smiled faintly. "Yes, I did." James hesitated. "What happens now?" Grace turned toward him. "That depends." James took a step closer. "I don't want you to leave." Grace searched his face. "James, I know the risks," he said, "the judgment, the headlines, the whispers." Grace laughed softly. "You've already lived with those." James reached for her hand, stopping just short. "May I?" Grace nodded. Their fingers intertwined. "This is real," James said. "Yes," Grace replied. It is." Oliver's voice called from inside. "Grace! Dad!" Grace smiled. James smiled too, but Margaret watched them from the doorway. And for the first time, she wasn't plotting. She was letting go. Morning light spilled through the windows, softer than it had been in a long time. Grace stood in the kitchen, barefoot again, but this time her shoulders weren't tense. The house felt different, lighter, as if it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for months. Oliver burst in first. "Grace, you're still here," she laughed. "I told you, some people stay." He ran into her arms, hugging her tightly. "Dad said we're all going to the park today." Grace looked up just as James entered, coffee in hand, a small tentative smile on his face. "If you're free," he added. "No pressure." Grace studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "I'd like that." At the park, Oliver ran ahead, fearless, laughter echoing across the grass. Grace and James walked behind him, their steps slow, deliberate. "I've been thinking," James said. "About what comes next?" Grace glanced at him. "That usually means something serious." James smiled. "It does. I don't want to rush you, or to find this before it's ready." Grace appreciated that more than he knew. "But," he continued, "I also don't want to pretend I don't feel this." Grace stopped walking. "Neither do I." They stood there, surrounded by ordinary life moving around them. Parents, children, dogs, nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. And yet, it felt monumental. James reached out, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I fell in love with you long before I realized it." Grace's breath caught. "I tried not to." James smiled gently. "I know." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I told myself I was just doing my job. And I told myself I was just grateful," he said. "We were both lying." Grace met his gaze. "Maybe we were just protecting ourselves." James stepped closer. "We don't have to anymore." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Grace didn't. Their kiss was soft at first, uncertain, then surer, warmer, like something that had been waiting patiently for permission. Oliver whooped from across the park. "Ew, you're kissing." They broke apart, laughing. Later that afternoon, Margaret watched them from the porch as they returned home together. Grace hesitated when she saw her. Old habits died hard. Margaret stepped forward. "Grace, Yes? I was wrong, Margaret said quietly. About many things, Grace nodded. I know, Margaret exhaled. You protected my grandson when I couldn't see past my fear. Grace softened. We both wanted the same thing. Margaret's voice trembled slightly. I don't expect forgiveness. Grace considered her words. Then she smiled. This family doesn't need more walls. Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes. Thank you. That evening, Grace stood in her room, folding clothes into her suitcase. James leaned against the doorframe. You're leaving? Grace shook her head. I'm unpacking. James laughed, relief washing over his face. Good, he said, because I was hoping you'd stay, not as the babysitter. Grace raised an eyebrow. Oh? As family, James said softly, if you want. Grace closed the suitcase and walked toward him. I think I already am. Months later, the house rang with laughter again. Grace no longer moved like a shadow. She took up space. She spoke freely. She stayed. James learned that love didn't have to be loud to be strong. Oliver learned that family didn't disappear when truth arrived. It grew. And Margaret learned that control was never the same thing as care. Some people enter your life quietly. They don't demand attention. They don't announce their worth. They simply stay until love makes them impossible to ignore. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe. Your support truly helps us keep sharing stories like this. And tell us, how did this story make you feel? Grace once believed silence was safety, but love taught her something braver. Sometimes staying is the boldest thing you can do.